The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and she stepped out into a floor that felt colder than the rest of the building. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something sharper, money, maybe, or the quiet pressure of decisions made far above ordinary lives. She paused for half a second, smoothing the front of her blazer, feeling the familiar weight of being watched even when no one was openly staring. The hallway stretched wide and white, glass walls on one side revealing conference rooms filled with people who all seemed to belong. Their laughter was muted behind the glass, but it carried confidence. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, not because it was slipping, but because it gave her hands something to do. She had arrived 10 minutes early. Always early. The kind of early people rarely noticed unless they were looking for flaws. At the reception desk, a young man barely glanced up when she said her name. He nodded once, pointed toward a row of minimalist chairs, and went back to his screen. She sat. From where she was, she could see her reflection in the polished floor. Neatly braided hair pulled back, simple earrings, shoes that were clean but clearly not new. She looked professional. Prepared. She reminded herself of that because experience had taught her others might not see it the same way. A door opened across the hall. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped out, speaking animatedly into his phone. He walked past her without slowing, without looking, as if she were part of the furniture. She followed him with her eyes, watching how easily he moved, how the building seemed to bend around him. She had researched this company obsessively. Their growth. Their leadership. Their culture statements that talked about inclusion and opportunity. She knew the CEO's interviews by heart. He liked to talk about innovation, about spotting talent in unexpected places. She believed him. Or at least, she had wanted to. Interview for operations analyst? She looked up. A woman stood there, tablet tucked against her chest, smile fixed but distant. She nodded and stood quickly. This way, the woman said, already turning. They walked into a conference room that was all glass and steel. A long table dominated the center, perfectly aligned chairs on either side. 3 people sat waiting. All of them looked up at once. Their eyes flicked over her, fast but thorough, like scanning a barcode. She smiled. They returned it, but not fully. Please have a seat, one of them said, gesturing to the far end of the table. She sat, placing her bag neatly at her feet. She folded her hands in front of her, steadying her breathing. She had done this before. Many times. The questions began politely enough. Education. Experience. Past roles. She answered clearly, confidently, drawing from years of work she had done quietly, often without recognition. She spoke about solving workflow bottlenecks, about saving a previous employer millions through restructuring, about leading teams that no one else wanted to manage. As she spoke, she noticed small things. One interviewer nodded without really listening. Another scribbled something down the moment she mentioned the neighborhood she grew up in. The third smiled, but his eyes drifted toward the window behind her as if the city outside were more interesting. She kept going anyway. When she finished one answer, there was a pause, just a beat too long. The kind of pause that wasn't about thinking, but about deciding. Well, one of them said, clearing his throat. You're clearly capable. But this role requires a certain presence. She tilted her head slightly. Could you explain what you mean by that? He hesitated, then smiled. You know. Client-facing confidence. A strong cultural fit. There it was. She nodded slowly, absorbing the familiar sting without letting it show on her face. She had learned how to do that years ago, how to feel the weight without flinching. I've led presentations for executives and external partners, she said calmly. Across multiple industries. Yes, of course, another interviewer said quickly. But our environment is fast-paced. Demanding. She almost smiled. Almost. Before she could respond, the door swung open. The room seemed to straighten itself. The CEO walked in, irritation written across his face, jacket still unbuttoned, phone in hand. Why is everyone sitting? He snapped. We're 5 minutes out. One of the interviewers stood abruptly. Sir, there's an issue with the overseas servers. The merger files. What kind of issue? The CEO demanded. They're not loading. The presentation data is corrupted. Her attention sharpened instantly. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She listened. The CEO swore under his breath. That presentation is the deal. Fix it. Hands flew into motion. Phones came out. Someone opened a laptop. Voices overlapped, tension rising like static in the air. She watched it unfold, recognizing patterns she had seen before. The frantic energy. The narrow focus. The way panic made people miss obvious things. She leaned back slightly, eyes on the screen as error messages flashed briefly before disappearing. She noticed the timestamps. The sequence. A familiar knot formed in her chest, not fear, but certainty. She knew what it was. She swallowed. This wasn't her interview anymore. Not really. Still, she stayed silent. The CEO paced once, then stopped. His eyes finally landed on her. Who is this? An interview candidate, someone said quickly. We were just wrapping up. Wrapping up. The words settled heavily in her chest. The CEO nodded, already turning back to the problem. Fine. Clear the room if you have to. I want this fixed. The tension thickened. Someone muttered about calling IT. Someone else suggested rebooting everything. She knew that would make it worse. Her fingers curled slightly against her palm. She told herself not to speak. She had learned that lesson too, how speaking at the wrong time could cost you more than silence ever would. But then the screen flickered again. A timer appeared in the corner. 5 minutes until the live investor call. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing what was coming if no one intervened. She took a breath. If the encryption keys rotated during the last update, she said carefully, the issue might not be the servers themselves. The room froze. One interviewer turned toward her sharply. This is an internal technical matter. She nodded once. I understand. But the CEO was already looking at her, studying her face, as if seeing her properly for the first time. Not as a candidate. Not as an interruption. As an unknown variable. The timer ticked down. She felt every second like pressure against her ribs. She didn't know yet whether speaking up would cost her the job she was already being denied, or change everything. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. They were about to lose everything. And she was the only one in the room who could see it coming. The room did not relax after she spoke. If anything, it tightened, like a muscle bracing for impact. The air felt heavier, charged with something no one wanted to name. The interviewer who had cut her off shifted in his chair, irritation flashing across his face as if her voice itself had disrupted an order that was already decided. We have a dedicated technical team, he said, forcing a thin smile. They're handling it. She nodded again, slower this time. She didn't argue. She didn't push. She had learned that confidence, when wrapped in the wrong skin, was often mistaken for arrogance. Still, she could feel the seconds slipping away, each one bringing the company closer to a very public failure. The CEO snapped his fingers. Why isn't the system responding? A young man at the far end of the table stammered, eyes glued to his laptop. We're trying to re-establish access, sir. The servers are live, but the data packets aren't. Speak English. The CEO cut in. They're rejecting the credentials, the man said quietly. She felt it then. That sharp, unmistakable recognition. The same problem she had seen 3 years ago at a logistics firm that nearly collapsed because no one listened to her until it was almost too late. Her fingers twitched. Another executive leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly. We should delay the call. No, the CEO said instantly. A delay tells investors we're unstable. The timer on the screen dropped to 4 minutes. One of the interviewers glanced at her, annoyance creeping into his expression. This is highly confidential, he said, lowering his voice as if she might leak trade secrets just by hearing them. Perhaps you could step outside while we resolve this. There it was. The dismissal wrapped in politeness. She stood slowly, meeting his eyes. Of course. As she moved toward the door, she caught fragments of hurried conversation behind her. Words like loss, credibility, exposure. No one noticed how close she was to stopping everything from unraveling. Her hand hovered over the door handle. The screen flickered again. An alert popped up, red this time. Sir? Someone said, panic now creeping into his voice. The backup node just failed. The CEO swore sharply and slammed his palm against the table. How does a backup fail? No one answered. She closed her eyes for half a second. Then she turned around. You're escalating the failure, she said, her voice calm but firm. Every restart forces the system to reject the corrupted key again. Silence hit the room like a wave. One of the recruiters stood up abruptly. You were asked to leave. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her gaze made him stop mid-sentence. Not anger. Not defiance. Certainty. The CEO raised a hand. Wait. Everyone froze. He studied her the way powerful men often studied people when something didn't fit their expectations. Slowly. Critically. As if deciding whether a risk was worth taking. You seem confident, he said. I am, she replied. Because I've seen this exact failure before. A low murmur rippled around the table. The timer dropped to 3 minutes. Say I let you talk, the CEO said. Why shouldn't I have you escorted out if you're wrong? She didn't hesitate. Because if I'm wrong, you lose nothing you aren't already losing. That landed. The CEO exhaled through his nose, then gestured toward the screen. Explain. Quickly. She walked back to the table, aware of every eye on her now. She could feel their doubt, their discomfort, the way the room subtly resisted her presence. But she ignored it. She focused on the problem. You updated the encryption protocol last night, she said. But one of your regional firewalls is still running a legacy configuration. It's rejecting the new key, corrupting the sync. That system was phased out. An executive argued. No, she said softly. It was scheduled to be. There's a difference. Someone pulled up a log. Scrolled. Froze. The color drained from his face. She's right. The recruiter who had dismissed her earlier looked at the screen, then at her, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. The CEO straightened. Why didn't anyone catch this? No one answered. The timer dropped to 2 minutes. She pointed to the screen. You don't need a full reset. You need to isolate the node and authenticate using the old key, just long enough to regenerate clean credentials. That would take too long, someone said. And if it fails? If you do nothing? She interrupted. You fail in front of everyone. The room went quiet again. Not the awkward quiet from earlier, but something sharper. Something that cut through egos and titles. The CEO looked at her for a long moment. What's your name? She told him. He nodded once, committing it to memory. Who taught you this? No one, she said. I learned because I had to. The timer hit 90 seconds. Do it, the CEO said suddenly. A few heads snapped toward him. Sir? No, he repeated. Hands flew over keyboards. Commands were entered. Lines of code scrolled faster than most of the room could follow. She stood there, heart steady but pounding, watching the process unfold. She caught a mistake before it happened and spoke up again, redirecting them just in time. Someone muttered, How does she know this? The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to justify disbelief. The timer dropped to 30 seconds. The screen went black. A collective breath sucked in. 10 seconds passed. Then the presentation loaded. Perfect. Clean. Stable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the investor interface came online, faces filling the screen, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. The CEO let out a slow breath and straightened his jacket. Begin, he said calmly, as if chaos hadn't ruled the room seconds earlier. The call started. Voices turned smooth, confident, rehearsed. The crisis vanished behind polished language and corporate smiles. She stepped back quietly, becoming invisible again as the meeting moved forward without her. But the room was not the same anymore. She felt it in the way people glanced at her now. In the way one of the recruiters avoided her eyes. In the way the CEO watched her reflection in the glass while speaking to investors. When the call ended, applause broke out, nervous, relieved. The CEO turned toward her fully. "You saved us," he said. She met his gaze. "I told you the problem wasn't the servers." He nodded slowly. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, shifting alliances, silent recalculations. She knew what was coming next. The question wasn't whether she was qualified anymore. It was whether they were ready to face why they had almost sent her away. The applause faded, but the tension did not leave the room. It settled instead, heavy and uncertain, clinging to every polished surface and every carefully composed expression. People returned to their seats, straightening jackets, smoothing ties, pretending the last 10 minutes had been nothing more than an unexpected hiccup. But no one could fully ignore the shift that had just taken place. She stood near the edge of the table, hands loosely folded, aware that she had crossed an invisible line. Moments ago, she had been an outsider, a temporary presence waiting to be dismissed. Now, she was the reason the company still stood upright. The contrast felt unreal, almost fragile, as if it could collapse again at any second. One of the recruiters cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "That was fortunate timing." She said nothing. She had learned long ago that moments like this revealed more when you stayed quiet. The CEO dismissed the rest of the executives with a brief nod, instructing them to prepare follow-up materials for the investors. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people filed out, casting sideways glances at her, curiosity and discomfort mixing in equal measure. Some looked impressed. Others looked unsettled, as if her competence had disrupted a story they were more comfortable believing. When the room finally emptied, the silence became sharper. The CEO turned fully toward her, arms crossed, studying her with the same intensity he might study a balance sheet after an unexpected fluctuation. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "Most people would have." She met his gaze evenly. "Hesitation costs more than action when systems are already failing." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "You understood our infrastructure better than people who built it." "I understood the problem," she corrected. "Titles don't fix issues. Attention does." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth before fading. "You realize you weren't supposed to know any of that." "I realize no one else did," she replied. He exhaled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Why didn't you speak sooner?" She paused. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew how it would sound. "Because I've learned that speaking too early makes people stop listening," she said finally. "Especially when they've already decided who you are." The words hung between them. The CEO's expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. "You think we decided that?" "I know you did." He didn't argue. Instead, he gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." She hesitated for just a second, then sat, resting her hands on the table. She noticed how different the room felt now that it was just the two of them. Less performative. More honest. "Tell me where you learned all this," he said. She looked past him, out through the glass wall, where the city stretched endlessly in every direction. "I started in places like this," she said quietly. "But never on this floor. I worked nights. Back-end systems. Fixing things after everyone else went home." He listened. "I watched mistakes repeat themselves," she continued. "Watched people ignore warnings because they came from the wrong voices. So I studied. I learned. I solved problems before they became disasters." "Yet you're not in a senior role," he said. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "People don't promote what makes them uncomfortable." The CEO leaned back, folding his hands. You realize what you did today puts us in an awkward position. She nodded. I figured. You proved we were wrong, he said. And companies don't like admitting that. She met his eyes again. Neither do people. A long silence followed. Not empty, but full. The kind of silence that forced truth to surface whether anyone wanted it to or not. Do you know why I started this company? The CEO asked suddenly. She shook her head. Because I was overlooked, he said. I wasn't the obvious choice. I didn't look like the typical leader they expected. She raised an eyebrow slightly. I know, he added, reading her expression. The irony isn't lost on me. He stood and walked toward the glass wall, hands clasped behind his back. When you walked in, I didn't see a problem solver. I saw someone who didn't fit the image we've built of ourselves. She stayed silent, letting him continue. And that almost cost us everything, he said. He turned back toward her. You didn't just fix a technical issue. You exposed a blind spot. The weight of his words settled slowly. What happens now? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up her resume from the table, the same one the recruiters had nearly dismissed. He flipped through it again, this time actually reading it. These accomplishments, he said. They're real. Yes. And yet my team nearly sent you home. Yes. He closed the folder and set it down carefully. I want you to stay. Not as a candidate. As a consultant. At least for now. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. With what authority? With mine, he said without hesitation. She considered that. Authority without backing becomes isolation. He nodded. You're right. He walked back to his seat. Then let's make it official. Before she could respond, the door opened slightly. One of the executives peeked in. Sir, the board wants a debrief. The CEO didn't break eye contact with her. They can wait. The executive hesitated, surprised, then nodded and disappeared. The CEO leaned forward. You changed the trajectory of this company in less than 15 minutes, he said. But that also makes you a threat to people who benefit from the way things were. I'm aware, she said. Are you willing to deal with that? She thought of the long nights, the overlooked work, the quiet victories no one celebrated. She thought of how close she had come to walking out of this building without anyone ever knowing what she could do. I've been dealing with it my entire career, she said. He studied her for a moment longer, then smiled, not the polite corporate smile from earlier, but something more genuine. Good, he said. Because the hardest part isn't fixing systems. It's fixing people. Outside the conference room, voices grew louder as news spread. People whispered her name now. Not with dismissal, but with curiosity. She knew the final test was still coming. Saving the company was one thing. Forcing it to confront its own reflection would be much harder. The boardroom filled slowly, the way rooms always did when something important had happened and no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Executives took their seats with careful movements, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, clearing throats that weren't dry. The crisis had passed, but its shadow lingered. Everyone knew it. No one said it. She stood near the window at first, watching the city move below like nothing had almost gone wrong. Cars flowed. People crossed streets. Life continued, unaware of how fragile confidence really was. The CEO entered last. The room quieted instantly. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he looked around the table, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle people who were used to control. Then his gaze landed on her. I want to begin, he said, by acknowledging what nearly happened today. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. We were minutes away from a public failure that would have cost this company credibility, trust, and long-term stability. He continued. And we didn't see it coming. No one spoke. The reason we didn't, he said, is not because the problem was invisible. It's because we ignored the person who saw it first. All eyes turned toward her. She felt the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders, heavy but steady. This wasn't triumph. This was exposure. The CEO gestured toward her. She identified the issue, diagnosed it, and guided the solution under pressure. Without her, we wouldn't be sitting here. One of the recruiters swallowed hard. Another executive cleared his throat. With all due respect, he began cautiously. She's not even an employee. That, the CEO replied calmly, is the point. The room stilled again. We talk about innovation, he said. We talk about diversity of thought. And yet today, when the most critical insight came from someone who didn't match our expectations, our instinct was to dismiss it. His voice hardened slightly. That instinct nearly destroyed us. She felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the release of something long held back. The truth was finally being spoken out loud. The CEO turned to her. I offered you a role earlier. You didn't accept it immediately. She met his gaze. Because I needed to know what kind of company I'd be working for. A murmur rippled through the room. And now? He asked. She stepped forward, the sound of her shoes against the floor sharp in the silence. Now I want to be clear. I don't want to be the exception that proves the rule. I don't want to be the person you point to and say, see, we're fair. She paused, letting the words sink in. I want to work in a place where I wouldn't have had to save the company just to be taken seriously. No one interrupted her. The CEO nodded slowly. Then help me build that place. He turned back to the room. Effective immediately, she will lead a full audit of our systems and our decision-making processes. Not just technical. Cultural. That word landed harder than any technical term ever could. She will report directly to me, he continued. And her recommendations will not be optional. One executive opened his mouth, then closed it again. The power in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Later, as the meeting broke apart, people approached her one by one. Some congratulated her awkwardly. Some asked careful questions. Others simply nodded, acknowledging her in a way they hadn't before. One of the recruiters stopped in front of her, eyes lowered. I misjudged you, he said quietly. She studied him for a moment. No, she replied. You judged me exactly the way you were taught to. He looked up, surprised. The question, she added gently, is what you do now. He nodded once, thoughtfully, and stepped away. As the afternoon wore on, emails flew. Meetings were scheduled. Her calendar filled rapidly, each notification another reminder that her life had just shifted direction. Yet beneath the momentum, she felt something deeper settling into place, a sense of alignment she hadn't known she was missing. In the early evening, the CEO found her again, standing by the same window. You didn't have to push as hard as you did, he said. You could have taken the win quietly. She smiled faintly. Quiet wins don't change systems. He laughed softly at that, then grew serious. You know people will resist you. I expect them to, she said. And you know some will try to undermine you. I've survived worse than that, she replied. He extended his hand again, not as an apology this time, not as an offer, but as acknowledgement of partnership. She shook it. As she left the building that evening, the lobby felt different. The same marble. The same glass. But the air no longer pressed down on her chest. People looked up when she passed now. Some smiled. Some stepped aside. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one. She paused on the steps, breathing in the cool air, letting the day finally settle into memory. She thought about the version of herself who had walked in that morning, prepared to be overlooked once again. She thought about how close she had come to leaving without anyone ever knowing what she could do. They had rejected her at a job interview. They had nearly lost everything because of it. And now, because she refused to stay silent, because she chose clarity over comfort, the doors that once closed quietly behind her stood wide open, not just for her, but for whoever came next. She walked away knowing one thing with absolute certainty. She was never asking for a seat at the table again. She was helping decide who got to sit there at all.